Good morning, and welcome to the CA Youth Services Interest Group presentation. It starts here, teaching and promoting anti-bias and social justice in children's programs. My name is Janice Buck, and I'm with the Sacramento Public Library, and I'm the Youth Services Chair for the YSIG Interest Group. And I'll be moderating today's program. Since YSIG pitched this presentation earlier this year, it has become even a more timely issue with the passing months as the climate of intolerance, bullying, and bigotry has intensified in our country and in our neighborhoods. With the theme of this year's conference, New Worlds Emerge, we who serve children have a unique opportunity to try to create a world like we would like to see it. But where exactly do we start with that? What kind of programs can we offer in our communities to assist families with talking to their children about these important values that we want to instill, such as respect for others, regardless of race, gender, orientation, ability, and religious beliefs? And when I say assisting families to talk with their children, I mean all families, not just families who don't have the privilege and luxury of avoiding these talks about the differences that often make them a target. We all need to be having this talk with our children, and we need to be having it again and again. In our communities, with these principles, we can design programs to meet the needs of advancing anti-bias, social justice issues. So today, I'm pleased to introduce to you two speakers who have the experience to provide an overview of these concerns. Liz Vogel is the Los Angeles Executive Director for Facing Histories and Ourselves, which is a global nonprofit that combats bigotry and hatred through education. They have a network of over 50,000 educators that they work with to reach 5.3 million students around the world each year. Facing Histories equips teachers and students with the tools to wrestle with today's most challenging issues, using the lens of history to illuminate the moral discussions young people face in their day-to-day lives. An avid yogi, Liz hails from Jersey Shore, but claims fierce allegiance to her California lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Charlotte Mills is the branch manager for the Lemon Grove Library and formerly the branch manager of Spring Valley Library and San Diego County Library Systems. As a librarian of color, Charlotte is committed to advocating for equality in library services. She's passionate about empowering community members through education and programs that celebrate cultural heritage. Before becoming a librarian, sorry, that's a lot of B's there. Charlotte worked in nonprofits. A Chicago native, she enjoys sunny California, but she does miss good pizza. So without further ado, please welcome Charlotte and Liz.
One second. Okay, hopefully you can see that pretty well and you can hear me. As she mentioned, my name is Charlotte King Mills, and I am the branch manager of the Lemon Grove Library, which is a branch of the San Diego County Library System. And I'd like to speak with you today. Sorry, that should not be happening. About joyful resistance, empowering community through radical inclusivity. Is access the same as equity? Libraries are meant to provide open access for all. I think that's something that we can agree to as librarians. However, what is our role in really bridging gaps? How do we address issues like structural racism, sexism, our customers facing gaps in education, and food insecurity? This is a quote from a library article that appeared in the June 2017 edition of Library Journal that I found very, very helpful and useful for me in thinking through this topic. And I do have a list of resources on the back table, and I include a link to this article for you to read at a later date. And basically, they write that libraries of all types are reevaluating the role they play in their community, questioning whether it is still good enough to provide equal access, or if it is time to pursue an active, equitable access that focuses on empowering the less powerful and amplifying the voices of the unheard. I'll be using a lot of the language that I found in that article today because it kind of helped me think through the topic. And it helped me think through this idea of radical inclusivity and what does that mean? I think we can all agree when we say that libraries should be open spaces and safe spaces for all. However, what do we really mean when we say that? There's a power in saying, yes, I see you. You are visible. And I want to hear and amplify what you have to say. We all should subscribe to this idea, right? But how do we enact a practice that deeply exemplifies that belief? And especially in these times. It's one thing to say we're open spaces for everyone, and it's another to connect deeply with that mission and provide the inclusivity that welcomes folks to enter and helps them feel affirmed when they're in the space. What is the library's role in helping community members reclaim their space, and how do we communicate value? Libraries can also be spaces to celebrate the uniqueness of your community. Teaching young people about their cultural lineage is really a radical act, and including their voices in library decision-making and programming is a path towards that deep inclusion. You want to make room for the people in your community to participate vigorously in library programming. Invite community members of all types to be a part of the Friends of the Library group and to be active voices in what they see is missing from library programs. You don't want to just rely on traditional experts, right? You want to make sure that all community members who have a vested interest in the topic feel valued and affirmed in giving their voices to help determine what kind of programming efforts you're going to be relying on. So I'm going to specifically focus on the Spring Valley Library, even though I'm currently the branch manager of the Lemon Grove Library. I previously was the Spring Valley Library branch manager. And I want to really emphasize that this is my experience, right? It's how I worked within that branch and within my library system to really provide and address certain issues within the community. So hopefully this is helpful to you. I want to tell you a little bit about Spring Valley before we kind of launch into this, because I think it's important for you to know what the community was like, or is like. It's an unincorporated community within San Diego County. It has the highest population of Spanish-speaking community members within the county. Some demographic data. It's a very diverse community. Ethnically, there are about 11% Asian Americans who live within Spring Valley. It's about 11% African American and 50% Latino. The median household income is $60,000. Now let me tell you a little bit about that income data, right? I think it's skewed, and the reason why I believe it's skewed is because there are really two Spring Valleys. There's a Spring Valley where the library is located, and in those blocks there are lower income folks who live. However, there's another Spring Valley that's a little geographically further from the library. Spring Valley has become a place where many people who have been priced out of the housing market in San Diego City come to purchase homes, and so that has kind of skewed that income data. However, where our library services people, it's a little lower income folks who are living on those blocks. What else do I want to say about the branch? It's a high programming branch. Typically, the branch averages a little bit over 100 programs per month, and these are library-led and partner-led programs. The branches, that's a picture of the branch right there. It's very colorful. Hopefully you can see it. It's right in the middle of two schools. It's next door to an elementary school and a middle school. And so what that means is every day after school, the branch typically sees at least 300 unattended children who come in. And this is not an over-exaggeration. We get a lot of kids that come in after school, and so you have to have staff that's ready and prepared for that influx. So the programs that I'm going to kind of talk about today are a sampling of how we have established some programs to really embrace this idea of radical inclusivity. Karamu, which is a Swahili word that means feast of feasts, is one of those programs. Fiesta was not a program that I started. It was an inherited program of mine, and it's been going on for about 11 years now at the branch. And then the Back to School Jam, which I'm super proud of. It's a library-hosted, partner-led program. Our meals, and then our civil rights art display and workshop. So the Karamu is an annual celebration that's held every February during Black History Month. And the program is really a community kind of effort. We work with volunteers who reside in the community as well as a number of community groups to kind of plan the program every February. We rely on the help of the African American Association of County Employees to help solicit donations and to also help organize the performers for the day. In the past, we've had all sorts of different performers, and really the program is was established to celebrate and highlight cultures of the African diaspora. In the past, we've had the Martin Luther King Jr. Choir, and you can see them in the bottom right-hand corner perform. We've had capoeira perform, and that's the image on the left-hand side. And I don't know if you're familiar with capoeira, but capoeira is really, it's a Brazilian form of martial art that traces its roots back to slavery. And during that time, slaves were not allowed to learn how to have self-defense techniques, right? It was illegal, no different than literacy was illegal. And so they developed this sort of dance type of fighting technique, so it was kind of disguised and people really didn't realize what they were teaching one another. So we have invited them to come perform. The jazz band. So I want to tell you a little bit about the jazz band. One of the things that we find is really important when we're thinking about this idea of radical inclusivity is that the community members are actually a part of the celebration, where they're organically coming in and providing entertainment for one another and celebrating themselves in that space. And so the middle school that's next door to the library, they have a jazz band that is led by a wonderful music teacher. And they come in each year and they perform jazz music. They have instruments that they're playing for the attendees. And they do this every year. And it's a really great way for the kids to not only be involved intrinsically in the programming, but to celebrate themselves during that time. The Black Storytellers of San Diego come and they do story times every year during this event. And we also have a number of community resource vendors, including health screenings. Last year we had a college corner for the first time with representatives from 4 different schools, community colleges, and 4-year universities. And they speak to attendees about resources that are available to them, including financial aid and scholarships for students of color. So the Fiesta, as I mentioned, was an inherited program, and this is a program that we run every year in celebration of Latino History Month. This is the 11th year that the Fiesta actually is being held. It's really, I think, the most magical thing about the Fiesta is that it's really an intergenerational program. We have performers of all ages who participate in this event, including a group of Aztec dancers that come every year. And we have a group of seniors who are volunteers who are called La Rondalla, and they sing traditional Mexican folk songs. They come every year to participate in this annual event. This event also works with the Latino Association of County Employees to plan the programming efforts, as well as community members who come to the table and let us know what it is that they're expecting for the day. We have community resource vendors that come. We provide health screenings, and we also provide other resources on foster parenting and other kind of health issues that community members are grappling with. The Back to School Jam is very, very special and close to my heart. It's a wonderful, wonderful program that is held every August. I hope you can see these images. I know it's kind of bright with this light shining right on the screen, so hopefully you can see some of these happy faces. But this is a library-hosted, partner-led, collaborative event. And when I say collaborative, I mean it is a collaboration. There are 10 community partners that come together for this program, including the San Diego County Department of Parks and Recreation, Spring Valley Youth and Family Coalition, and the Family Health Resource Center in Spring Valley. And what these groups do is they solicit donations to provide children in grades K through 12 with a free backpack and free school supplies to get them ready for the school year. So typically, on average, every year, we're passing out between 800 to 1,000 free backpacks every August for kids. So it does a couple of things. It prepares children for school, right? It gets them excited and encourages them to be ready. It's a celebratory atmosphere, so it really kind of gets them happy and engaged during that time period. And it also helps relieve parents of the financial burdens of back to school time, right? During the back to school sessions, you're thinking about purchasing new clothing, shoes. It can be a real burden for many parents. And so this is a way to alleviate some of that, those burdens. One of our partners also organizes a Feeding America food pantry. And so parents who attend that, they're able to receive free produce and other kind of groceries. We also give kids free lunch during that time. So I want to talk a bit about meals. The Spring Valley Library is no different than many other California libraries in that it provides summer meals to students. We are able to get breakfast and lunch and dinner all throughout the summer, and we do that by applying to be a site through our school district. The school district also provides us with a lunch lady who comes in and serves the hot meals during the summer meals. But we provide the breakfast, and we have a partnership with the San Diego County Department of Parks and Rec to provide dinner every day. We also, however, realize that children are hungry throughout the year. As librarians, we understand kind of intrinsically that there's this connection between hunger and literacy, right? If you're hungry, you can't learn anything. You need to have a full belly. And so we're really uniquely poised to do something about that. So what we decided to do was contact the school district to get them to provide us with after-school snacks. After school, as I mentioned, we're getting close to 300 kids that are coming every single day, and for many of those kids, they're not eating until they go back to school the next day to get a lunch, right? And so these after-school snacks, which include a fruit, a vegetable, a grain, a milk, and a juice, can help kind of bridge that gap between when they leave school and go back to get their meals, their lunch. And this is a picture of some of our kids helping hand out the snack after school. They're a funny little crew. So the Civil Rights Art Project was a one-time kind of program that we held in, I believe it was June of last year, 2016. There's a local artist in San Diego, her name is Leah Goodwin, and she has ties to many civil rights leaders within the San Diego City region. She created an art exhibit of panels featuring these civil rights leaders. And on these panels, it gave information, background information on who they were, how they contributed to the civil rights movement, whether that was organizing a boycott or it was connecting community members to one another. So we had this art exhibit up for about a month, and towards the end of the month, Leah came into the branch to lead an art workshop with the children after school. And what this art workshop did, it was a collaborative project where it asked the question, what does community mean to me? And the kids really had to kind of think through this question. Many of them said that community means a peaceful place. Some said it means a clean environment. Others said it means something that's fun, a place for them to explore. And they created a collaborative mural that we then put up in our homework center for about a week after they created this art exhibit. And for them, I think it was something that was special because they not only got to contribute their voice, but they got to place this up in the branch afterwards so they could continually see that it had an impact on the people who came into the library. I want to talk a little bit about outreach. I want to make sure I leave enough time too for Liz because she's got, I know, a lot of really good information she's going to share with us. So community input means going to untraditional venues to reach folks. As librarians, I think we, kind of intrinsically know, let's go to schools, let's really talk to teachers, let's talk to students. But what about people who wouldn't necessarily normally know about us or come into our branch? So let's go to places like laundromats and do a story time there. Let's think about going to grocery stores and posting flyers, or even connecting with the managers of those grocery stores. You would be surprised where you could solicit donations from. We get a lot of donations for our larger events through local businesses. And we have those relationships by establishing that kind of rapport early on. Go to health clinics, go to community parks. I think it's important that you meet the people where they are at. Invite community members to assist with those outreach efforts, particularly culturally appropriate, right, outreach efforts. We want folks to consider using the library as a space, and we want them to get to know us as well. So what does equity look like in your community? This is a quote from PolicyLink, which is a really wonderful resource if you aren't familiar with it already. They basically write that equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all, including all racial and ethnic groups, can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Equity gives all people a just and fair shot in life despite historic patterns of racial and economic exclusion. It's super important for people to feel a sense of agency and selfhood. I feel like one of the most problematic elements of inequity is that it strips individuals of their humanity and their ability to experience joy and life in the fullest. There's a really great quote from J.K. Rowling, actually Dumbledore, and she writes, "Happiness can be found in the darkest of times if one simply remembers to turn on the light." And as librarians, it's not appropriate for us to think that we can solve all of the world's woes, right? It would be completely ridiculous for us to believe that. However, what we can do is try to turn on the light for people. And turning on the light is helping community members by offering specific resources and valuing them, welcoming their presence and honoring their humanity. We need to figure out where the gaps are in our specific communities. Is it food insecurity? Is it services for homelessness? Is it access to technology? Is it making sure that the staff who are in your branches resemble the community in which they are serving? Where are the gaps, and how do we solve those gaps by turning on the light for folks? So there are plenty of resources that are available, and I just wanted to share some of them with you. I have a couple of handouts on the back as well that hopefully will be useful to you. But I was recently at a conference, the African American Librarians Association conference in Atlanta, and I heard from some really wonderful librarians from the Denver Public Library, and they presented on their program, RADA, the Read Action Dialogue program. And what RADA does is it is a program that really uses literature and nonfiction as a springboard for discussion. For instance, they recently used Danielle Allen's book, Cuz, which is about her cousin who was incarcerated, and it looks at the prison industrial complex through a variety of kind of ways, right? So it brings different people who have different viewpoints into the room to talk about these issues. So that was a really wonderful program, I think. Also, the Conversation Project through the Oregon Humanities Council is super useful. And this toolkit, which was created by a number of wonderful librarians, including one of San Diego County Library's own, Amitha Lionel, is applying racial equity analysis to library policies, programs, and processes. So I did print out a couple of these toolkits for you, and they're on the back table if you'd like to grab one. You also want to figure out where the service connectors are in your community. In San Diego, it's simply a matter of calling 211 to figure out how to connect community members with issues like veterans resources, housing, food pantries, a variety of nonprofits. Perhaps it would be very difficult for you to create some huge back-to-school jam. You don't have to do that. You can have a monthly inReach and it will have a huge impact. And when I say a monthly inReach, that just is offering a nonprofit or an organization a table in your library hallway to provide community members with resources. We've done that several times. One of the examples is working with the Southern Caregiver Resource Center, who works primarily with family caregivers and seniors living with Alzheimer's. So think about having monthly inReach in your branches. Here's one more quote that I wanted to leave you with from that Library Journal article that I found really useful. And I just want to invite you to think about how equity, what it looks like in your community, and to kind of grapple with that question. And I know we're going to have a Q&A portion, but I do want to turn it over to Liz now. So thank you very much.
Good morning. Let me see if I can find mine. So I am very happy to be here. I'm a little bit shorter. I am happy to be here. I represent Facing History and Ourselves, and I think the way that we came to be part of this conference is that a colleague of mine in the Bay Area did a community program in partnership with the Oakland Libraries, like Oakland Library, and it was entitled Tough Stuff, sort of difficult conversations with children. And that's pretty aligned with the work that we do in combating bigotry and hatred through education. We're really a support mostly for teachers, but as well as for community members on how to really tackle and navigate some of the most challenging issues that might come up in classrooms, or for any of us who are working with young people. I have been reminded over and over of a quote, a letter by James Baldwin in 1963 in a talk to teachers. You may be familiar. He starts off by saying, let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. And I think you can't underscore what Janice started off by talking about the world that we're living in. And you may have been seeing some of the surveys that have been coming out recently about students in school having really heightened stress levels and anxiety levels, feeling concern for themselves, for their family members, for their communities, about things that are happening around us. Immigrant communities that feel targeted, the repeal of DACA. These are just some of the things that are, on our young people's minds. And so, for all of us who come into contact with young people, even if it's not front of mind, they're carrying sort of that stress with them. And so, what are the opportunities in big and small ways to be attentive to their needs? The talk by Baldwin continues by, he goes on to say, everyone in this room in one way or another is aware of that fact that we're living in a dangerous time. And he was talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He was talking about the murder of 4 young African-American girls in a church in Alabama. There are things that are happening in our world today that make it a dangerous place as well. And so again, sort of thinking about what's the responsibility and what's the opportunity that we have with young people. So I'll talk a little bit about what Facing History and Ourselves does. And my slides will probably be out of order because I think I'm going to go out of order. But essentially, I think the connection that I wanted to make to you all is that our approach is really about breaking down we and they, breaking down us and them. And there's such incredible opportunities to do that through storytelling. So we believe at Facing History that there's a real connection between the violence and hatred in history, that's connected to the fear, the human behavior sort of fear that we all have of the other, however the other is defined, and that all connects then to the moral and ethical choices that we make on a daily basis in small and large ways. And again, through our curriculum, these are these human behavior pieces are things that we explore over time, and there's rich opportunities to do that even in children's literature. So I wanted to move into a quick video. Some of you may be familiar with this author. I may not pronounce her name correctly, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, but she wrote We Are All Feminists, and she wrote Purple Hibiscus, and she wrote Americana, and she has an incredible TED Talk, and I wanted to show just a quick clip from that TED Talk, if I can find it.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
But I think the idea is just a reflection on how we might carry single stories, right? That we carry, that we think about maybe the young people who come into the library, but also the single stories that they may have, and how we do that as humans to make sense of the world and to categorize we and they. And so the idea that there's so much exploration, and that within the exploration of learning about people who are different, stories that are different from the ones that we know, that opens up the possibility for conversations that might be considered tough or might be considered difficult or taboo topics, but can be done with sort of more curiosity. Let's see. No, I can't advance my slides. Maybe I can do it that way. No. Sorry. So I'm going to fly through some of these slides just because I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure we do have a little bit of time for questions. But as I said, we're a nonprofit, and we work mostly with schools and teachers. Working with libraries was something that was relatively new for us, but makes a lot of sense, and we're eager to talk about how we might be in support of some of your programs. We're really about sort of civil dialogue. That's this idea of how to have respectful conversations about issues, and then also civic engagement, how to connect those conversations, especially for young people, to their sense of agency, that their choices matter, that what they do makes a difference in the world, and that actually, even as one individual, they can actually make a difference. We do mostly teacher training. We have resources, especially around pieces of literature, and then we work with the community. And I think, as Jenna said, we're a global organization. In California, for the purposes of this conference, we're in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, and we work with teachers in schools throughout the state. So there's opportunity that way. There's interest. I think this is just a sense of kind of how we think about all of this, that everything really is rooted, especially for young people, in their sense of identity, who they are. They're discovering who they are. And I think that through stories, there's often a sense to challenge or help them expand what they think they know. So there's a strategy, I don't have it on my slide, that we often use with young people, even whether it's an individual conversation or in a more of a classroom or a community setting. It's called the SIT strategy, which is, looking at something and looking at what is surprising, interesting, or troubling, and at the same time asking a series of questions. The questions I love to ask when a young person, my child or a student, comes with something that they know, right? They come with a fact, they've heard something's happened in the news, there's something going on in the world, and they know it and they have an idea about it. And trying to unpack that a little bit by asking, like, what do you know? How do you know? What do you think you know? How do you know? And what more do you want to know? Is something that I find is really helpful for finding where the space is to learn more, right? As opposed to feeling like there's a fixed single story, there's no discussion possible because they've already decided what they think or feel about a topic. And I think that the question of curiosity of what more would you want to know opens all of that up. Just in a few examples, because I know I had been asked to talk about resources potentially for younger children. Some of the books that we work with, you all are librarians, so you know so much more in terms of the catalogs than we do. I do have a few book lists that we find really valuable in the back of the room if you want to take them. But Catherine Atoshi's 1, 0, 2, her new book, Beautiful Hands, her book called Draw the Line, really carries these themes of inclusion, of sort of breaking down the walls of us and them and we and they in such beautifully illustrated ways that you can have the conversation of how to be inclusive with even very young children. Wonder, of course, I'm guessing most of you are familiar, but really the multiple perspective taking in that book and the opportunities to see where characters are making choices to be inclusive or making choices to show empathy, or where they're making choices based on judgments and sort of closing out other characters, is really ripe for great conversation about identity and difference and inclusion. To Kill a Mockingbird obviously is a classic, and I don't know if you know The Bear That Wasn't. It is an incredible story, again, of kind of outsiders and insiders, and who belongs, and how do we understand ourselves in relation to other people. These are a few tips. These are things that I think are useful, again, almost as much, if not more so, for the individual encounters, as opposed to how you can figure out how it might factor into your programming. But I think the context of kind of having a difficult conversation is really all about how you approach it. And I think sometimes with young people, we are in our heads a lot and anticipating what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And so the idea of being truthful about your feelings, but also giving them the space to share. And I love the idea of highlighting upstanders. I love the sense upstanders as opposed to bystanders, people who make, in history or in today, make small choices to be inclusive, to stand up for one another, to stand up to injustice. I think the sense of hope and optimism that is hard sometimes to carry through in what seems like a really challenging time. There are so many stories in literature and in our news and in our world where we can find people who are making those more positive choices. And so having that be part of an integral approach to what might be challenging topics. I wanted to make sure there were some voices of young people in the room, so we worked with a book called you might be familiar with the 6-word story, 6-word memoirs, newest book, 6 Words, Fresh Off the Boat, stories of immigration, identity, and coming to America. And we worked with a group of 150 students a couple of weeks ago and helped them think through some of the 6-word stories that they might share. They were all really powerful. This is just a quick sampling. And they were really excited to share it with go back to their school communities and share their stories and sort of the essence of what you can say in 6 carefully chosen words. I have a few Facing History and Ourselves resources, a few of the book lists that I had referenced earlier. And then these are resources, and I know the PowerPoints will be shared, that might be valuable to you and might feel connected to your work in libraries as well that are not so much about Facing History. But obviously, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I think I'll leave it here and see if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Charlotte. We're going to have a few minutes for some questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you a microphone if you need it. Yes.
Okay. I've got a question for Charlotte. When you're talking about I love the idea of the community members really helping to, getting a lot of feedback and guidance from them when you're designing these programs. And I wanted to know how long or how much time you allow before you create the program in order to get that real feedback.
Yeah,
what would you suggest?
that's a really good question. I think, sorry, hopefully you can hear me. So it depends
Sure.
on, okay, thank you. So we like to give at least 4 months per planning session logistically for each one. And the way it's kind of timed is the Back to School Jam is in August. So we typically start planning for that in March of the year before. And with Karamu, we try to plan at least 5 months out. A lot of the programs, when you first start them, I think it takes longer to establish the community partnerships. But really, our staff and we try to keep an eye out for active parents. So if a parent comes in who seems super involved or who, is really looking for resources for their child, we say, hey, do you want to participate in this planning committee? We're getting this program together. Would you really be interested in involving yourself? So those are some ways that we kind of involve different community members. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up to that, what are there some successes or pitfalls you've had in engaging parents in those committee meetings? When do the committee meetings meet? Do you offer food or a stipend or anything like that?
So no, we do not offer a stipend for participation in the meetings. Typically, that is a difficulty for us because typically the meetings honestly take place in the mornings, and so they're not necessarily times when a lot of parents are able, because there are a lot of working parents in that community. However, we do have surveys that we pass out to try to elicit more feedback from people who can't necessarily participate in actual planning events. And then our Friends of the Library, they're a small but mighty group in Spring Valley, and they help with a lot of the financing of the programs that we work on. And they're all community residents, so they also help get more community input that way. You're welcome.
Any more questions? Yes.
This question is for Liz. So if we're doing a story time or something for very young children, 2 or 3, this may be totally my parent, totally willing to own it and be brave about it, but do you have any tips for what we might say to a parent who doesn't really want us to take on some of these issues with their child? Maybe they're kind of still, we're going to talk about that when they're 5, not when they're 3 or whatever. Someone's upset about us going there, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of advice because I think I don't want to pretend to know your world as librarians. I definitely come into contact with parents who say to teachers, even in classrooms, I want to be the one sharing this information with my child, and so I think that's the navigation, and certainly with younger children, it's probably more and more sensitive. I think there are the reality is at every age, young people are absorbing what they're absorbing. So, it might be that highlighting positive messages of inclusion, positive messages about kindness, positive messages about difference doesn't mean bad, those kinds of things that are addressing without necessarily going head on for either younger kids or for, if it's it seems more sensitive or you're getting resistance. I think there are ways, especially through stories, to do that as well.
Thank you, Liz. Okay. So that is our time for today. Thank you everyone for coming. And again, this was presented by the Youth Services Interest Group of CLA. And we have a few things happening this afternoon. So I have some flyers here if you would like to learn more about YSIG, get involved, ask questions. Then please take a flyer. There's some on the back table, and then there are some right here. And again, thank you, Liz and Charlotte, so much.